We've just looked at the riches of India in terms of material wealth and the hugely important part India has played over thousands of years in the world's trade and economic activity. We must now look at the riches of a very different kind that India has brought to the world, its contribution in the form of ideas. This might go back as far as the origins of the Indo-European language family itself, from which most European languages, including English, descend from. However, that debate is far from settled. However, India's intellectual influence certainly does go back as far as the role India played as the spiritual home of the world's third largest religion and the family of philosophies that we now know as Hinduism. The fourth largest religion too, Buddhism, and two other major religions also born out of Hinduism, Jainism and Sikhism. We shall then chart some of India's intellectual influence right up to our own 21st century, when India has become a powerhouse of scientific innovation, not least in the key contributions made by Indians to the digital revolution, which is so rapidly transforming the life of the human race. According to Pew Research Foundation, there are approximately 1 billion Hindus in the world, about 500 million Buddhists, 23 million Sikhs, and 4 million Jains. Very nearly all Hindus, Sikhs, and Jains, in percentage terms, live in India. However, Buddhism, in the country of its birth, has declined over the last 2,000 years. And now most Buddhists are found in China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, not to mention America. Estimates for the number of Buddhists vary from 350 million to 1.5 billion, partly because it's hard to get data on people's beliefs in China, and also because many people in Asia practice syncretistic religions, which incorporate aspects of Buddhism along with Taoism, Confucianism, Shintoism, or animist beliefs. Hu Shi, the Chinese intellectual and ambassador of China to the United States early in the 20th century, famously said in a paper published by Harvard in 1936 that India conquered and dominated China culturally for 20 centuries without ever sending a single soldier across her border. His paper is titled The Indianization of China, a case study in cultural borrowing, and describes how Indian worldviews, through Buddhism, became so important to China. No wonder the Chinese name for India was Tianzhu, literally meaning the center of heaven. The old Japanese name for India, Tenjiku, meant the same. It's worth noting that the earliest books ever printed in the world on that fabulous Chinese invention, the block-cut printing press, were Buddhist sutras and dharanis, from the Lotus Sutra to the Diamond Sutra. These were often, in fact, printed in Sanskrit using the Siddham script. I'd suggest that one way of looking at the ultimate intention of all the great religions is to provide a way for human beings to establish a sense of oneness with themselves and with what they are doing on this earth, with other people, with nature and the world around them, and ultimately with that power and mind that created the universe. This is one of the core ideas of Hindu philosophy, set out in its greatest religious texts, from the earliest Vedas to the later Upanishads, and the most widely read text of them all, the Bhagavad Gita. The idea is this, that every living creature has a higher part within it, its Atman, its soul, which it must live up to so that it can be united with the eternal, universal soul of the world, Brahman. Unless we find and stay on that path, we stay trapped by our human ego in the world of Maya, or illusion, caught up in the interplay of opposites, so that we cannot see the world correctly. The same basic idea is at the heart of Buddhism, a later offshoot of that Vedic culture in northern India. That only when we are liberated from the distortions of the ego to see the world straight can we see the ultimate reality and reach that state the Buddhists call nirvana, where we are at one with the invisible power that lies behind everything, and of which the visible world, the world of the senses, is just a transient expression. So powerful was this message, and so sophisticated were the cultures that it helped inspire, that both Hindu and Buddhist ideas spread out from India across all the lands of the East, so that before the arrival of Islam, they dominated pretty much the whole of Asia, reaching as far as China, Korea and Japan to the north, and throughout the Indonesian archipelago to the east. The largest religious structure in the world, lost for centuries in the jungles of what is today Cambodia, is Angkor Wat. Covering the best part of a square mile, it was originally built in the 12th century as a Hindu temple complex, dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. But less than a century later, it was transformed into a Buddhist shrine and monastery, where it remains to this day. At its peak, Angkor Wat was at the heart of one of the largest cities in the world at its time, replete with sophisticated irrigation to look after its enormous, thriving urban population. Look across Asia today, and India now has by far the largest number of Hindus, 80% of its population of 1.3 billion. Although easily the second largest religion in India is Islam, with the third largest number of Muslims in the world, 171 million, putting it only just behind Pakistan and Indonesia. But the world's 500 million Buddhists dominate Sri Lanka, Burma, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos and Cambodia. They're a big presence further north in Tibet and other parts of China, Mongolia, Korea and Japan. Even in America, there are nearly 4 million Buddhists, giving it by far the largest Buddhist population outside of Asia. We shall return later to the wider influence of the deeper reaches of India's spiritual philosophy across the world. And in week 4, Complexity, we'll be briefly revisiting religion and philosophy. India also has an extensive poetic literature, kavya. For example, the 18-volume and 66,000-line Katha Sarit Sagar, the ocean of the streams of stories. An enormous compendium of tales that include some of my own favourites from the Panchatantra. India's folk and animal fables, like the Panchatantra, had a huge influence on storytelling to India's west. Aesop's fables in Greece, 1001 Arabian Nights in Persia, the Book of Sindbad, Boccaccio's Decameron and La Fontaine's fables in France, all have stories in them that originated in India. In 1980, the novelist Doris Lessing wrote of the Panchatantra. It is safe to say that most people in the West these days will not have heard of it, while they will certainly, at the very least, have heard of the Upanishads and the Vedas. Until comparatively recently, it was the other way round. There were at least 20 English translations in the 100 years before 1888. Pondering on these facts leads to reflection on the fate of books, as chancy and unpredictable as that of people or nations. Whilst I'm not sure if Doris Lessing is correct that most people have heard of the Upanishads and the Vedas, I do appreciate her sentiment. The Panchatantra and similar works are readily available in translation. They have fascinating themes. They're almost like mini MBAs in terms of how to live, how to work, how to choose friends, how to negotiate, how to take advice. There is much practical wisdom, niti, to be learned from them. Often they are read to children and in comic book form or as cartoons, but it's always good to go back to the original, which is really immersive, using a story within stories framing technique in the original complete version. It's ironic that 600 years after the Chinese printed Indian literature on their printing presses, that whilst Gutenberg started with the Bible in 1439, less than half a century later, German translations of the Panchatantra would be printed using it.